domains couldn't be addressed accordingly or in a way that it's becoming, it's unique. The second aspect to that related is the question of how to identify these things. So people call it object identification. You may have heard about the most well-known object identification mechanism, which is EPC Global and the EPC, the Electronic Product Code. Many people believe that's the standard, but we have to admit that as of today, we have only a few hundred companies signed up for the EPC Global standard. And just to compare that with a company like SAP, we have a couple of 10,000 customers. So if we would come up with an object ID mechanism and schema and would just populate that, we would immediately have a much larger customer base and usage than EPC Global maybe ever have. It's not our intent at this point in time, but just an indication that the discussion hasn't even started nor finished as many people believed once they started with EPC Global. Also, we have to understand there are industries like automotive and pharmaceutical who have clearly indicated that they are not willing to follow the EPC Global approach of buying these namespaces from EPC Global. So all in all, there's a big debate going on about how these object identification gonna take place. Europe wants to have a lead in this and initiates consultations throughout 2009, maybe late 2008, but for sure 2009 to understand that. Why is that important? Well, I need to understand what is that object, so the unique identifier of that object, in order to integrate that into my business processes. And so I have to understand what the object ID is. And either, which would be the best case, we have one global way of addressing objects. If we can't get that resolved, we need at least some kind of mapping mechanisms to understand how I can map from one ID to another ID. If I can't neither one, I won't be able to identify the object. And as these objects may occur in different sectors of different industries because they will be used in a different sector. Let's take an example. If you create a media device and you put it into a car, you have immediately two different sectors. You have a high-tech sector on one side, typically using RosettaNet and the like, and you have the automotive environment using EDI as a typical mechanism for B2B messages. How will the object be identified now? Which schema are we going to use? Or are we going to use two schemas and then have to map them from one into the other once that media device is being used within the car? Just a tiny little example of a big problem to be addressed. So all in all, naming and addressing these things in the Internet of Things will become very important, both from a protocol, IP protocol level, as well as from a business applications perspective. On top of that, we have the core business services that will form the Internet of Services, as Michael already laid it out. And these core business services in the future Internet should allow us to make a move from the Internet being an Internet of information to an Internet of tradable services. So we want to trade these services. We want to get them exposed, and we want them to use as a business service and not as a technical web service. So when I talk about services here in this context of Internet of Service, consider that to be an automated business service like you would expect from a service consultant or any service company. If you want to do that, you need, of course, to understand who's going to offer that service to you, and can you trust this entity? Is it reliable? Can you depend on that service even in 10 years from now? Could you build it into your own application? Is there a notion and a concept of service level agreement that would allow you to reuse that service in a larger context, compose it with other services, providing a so-called composite service on top of it. And that all will then end up in a question of how will that scale? How many of these services can we expect? Should we predict? How many of these services will compete because they are similar in its kind? And if there are multiple of them, how do we find them? These are topics I will stress a little bit later as well. So this is what the future internet is going to be from the perspective of the iStack and many others that we have talked to in the context of writing this report on the future internet. And on top of that, what we see is an emerging industry, we call it the web-based service industry, which differs from the today's industry in a sense that they can largely rely on the internet as their provisioning environment for their business services. So practically they have no need, quote unquote, at the day's end, to have any other means of infrastructure to provide their services to their customer base. Even further, it becomes the question which I raised already yesterday in the opening ceremony of what is an enterprise any longer, and do I need an enterprise to provide that service to me? It's becoming a very virtual entity for me, and it could be possible that an individual is creating a service and propagating and proposing it on the net in a way that you would consider this a major industry company behind that offering that service to you. Just think about, as I mentioned yesterday, an example of a car insurance company. There's no need that this company has any physical existence any longer because most of these services will be fully provided online, and at the end of the day can be a completely virtual enterprise that at best has a postal address somewhere. And so if that is going to happen, first of all, we get a new sector, a sector that hasn't been, that there wasn't in existence before. We know some examples. Michael mentioned Google in the context of Chrome. Google is the first of its kind, of this kind. Facebook and others are similar to that. And we can envision that it's not individual companies we'll talk about in 5 to 10 years, but we call them a new sector, and what we currently entitle as web-based service industry. Following that, it's becoming obvious that others have to follow, and so we see existing sectors are turning into sectors that will largely benefit from what we call web-based service industries, and that includes companies like us. If you are a little bit familiar with our company, you may have heard that we have launched our first enterprise application as software as a service called By Design for the mid-sized market. And that's a first step towards providing our products and offerings as a service through the net. And it's just a starting point. We can envision that things like that will happen over and over again. Now, can all of these services be automated? Truly not. We have, of course, standard business services still to encounter. And so the idea of the web-based service industry includes the question about how to combine existing business services with automated services. That could lead to completely new ways on how to provide services to customers. Just taking an example, a travel agency may be able online to provide to you a completely personalized, composed service that really fits your needs once you plan a trip like me from Germany all the way here to Brisbane. And it's not that I have to deal, or better I should say my secretary has to deal with all the individual aspects of my trip, including the flights, the hotel booking, the rental car, the preferences that I have, the itinerary that I have that needs to be adjusted on a daily basis and what have you. Today, you won't find anyone who's capable to manage that for me other than my secretary, or if I wouldn't have a secretary, I would have to do it on my own. Tomorrow we expect that travel agencies being capable to do that because they get enough information from you, so enough semantic information that they can provide this kind of service to you permanently, so to say, in real time. This is an example how you combine business services with automated services easily. There are many other examples like that. So this is the vision that we have created at the ISTAC that we are now sharing internationally. Michael mentioned it. We had the pleasure earlier this year in May conducting the International Research Forum. Michael was representing QUT there. Max was also there, and we discussed exactly this kind of a vision and compared that with